Welcome to Energy Solutions, a podcast from the Electric Power Supply Association, where we showcase the voices and stories behind America's changing electric grid. I'm your host, Todd Snitchler, EPSA's president and CEO. EPSA advocates every day on behalf of competitive power suppliers and for competitive power markets that enable efficient, innovative, and above all, reliable electric generation. Without competition, utilities, overseen by regulators, control all parts of the power generation and delivery process in their service territory. In areas with restructured, competitive power markets, many companies can compete to provide power generation options. This drives down costs, encourages innovation, has reduced emissions, and secures reliable electricity. It also shifts the investment risk off of the customer. But as the world rapidly changes and new challenges emerge, many are questioning the best way to continue providing safe, reliable, cost-effective, and cleaner power. For some, that means reforming power markets. For others, it could mean doing away with competition entirely. This episode's guest is Lynne Kiesling. She's an economist focusing on regulation, market design, and the economics of digitization and the smart grid technologies used in the electricity industry. She is a research professor in the School of Engineering, Design, and Computing at the University of Colorado, Denver, and co-director of the Institute for Regulatory Law and Economics, as well as an adjunct professor at the Institute for Sustainability and Energy at Northwestern University. She is also currently a member of the U.S. Department of Energy's Electricity Advisory Committee. Her full resume is far too long to list here. You can find it on our show notes at epsa.org. Lynne is an expert on electric competition. We asked her on to help walk through why competitive power markets were created, misperceptions and what critics get wrong about them, and how we can move forward to encourage more innovation and sustainable power solutions. Here's Lynne. Well, Lynne, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We've been looking forward to having you for some time on our podcast because, of course, you are a noted expert on electric competition and have been doing a lot of writing of late and have for some time about the issue. And so your insights are particularly helpful as we are looking at really a lot of big questions around the markets as where we are with energy policy today. So maybe before we begin, for those that don't know you, who listen to this podcast, who can't imagine who that would be, but give us a quick download on how you got into the space and kind of where you focused some of your writing and, and how does electric competition, how'd you kind of stumble into that? Because it's not a thing a lot of people choose to get into.
No. Thanks, Todd. And thank you for having me. This is, I've been looking forward to this conversation as well. And it's a topic near and dear to my heart. As you just alluded to, I spend way more of my time than I think my family thinks I should on thinking about electricity issues. But I'm an economist, and within economics, there's various fields that you can specialize in.
Sure.
And one of my specialty fields is called industrial organization. And so that's the field where you study market structures, industry structures, competition dynamics, things like that. And also antitrust and regulation. And so regulation has always been a focus of mine. I actually started working on with electricity questions when I was an undergraduate. My mother at the time was an economist for American Electric Power.
Oh, and you come by it naturally then.
I do. And I called home one day and I'm like, I have to write a senior honors thesis and I need some data. And so she asked if it would be okay if I could use some of the historical data from the
Sure.
region that she was responsible for forecasting. And so I did my undergraduate honors thesis on electricity pricing in the 1970s and how it responded to the exogenous shocks of the oil price shocks.
Yep.
So I come by it honestly. And then I started really getting back in, and I went off for my PhD and did industrial organization and mechanism design and economic history, which is an interesting combination. But I find that a lot of people who think about the questions you and I think about aren't very familiar with the history of the technology and the economics and the regulation in this industry.
Yeah.
And so when I can bring that into a conversation, I think a lot of people find it really illuminating because they're just not familiar with it.
Well, given that deep background, I know I have my perspectives, but I'm curious from your perspective, how do you view the genesis of electric competition? What benefits was it intended to provide, and has it provided them over the last few decades? Kind of the history piece, and then we can talk about the where are we now and where are we going?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, and that's a great place to start because it really does bring in this history of the second half of the 20th century. And that I can also recommend some readings along the way for folks who want some more background.
We'll put those in the podcast notes.
Great. And so, by the 1960s, we had really achieved, what in hindsight we look back and think of as the engineering marvel of the 20th century. We had really achieved that objective of near universal electrification and having an integrated system that was safe, reliable, and affordable. And the technology that was based on, that very mechanical, lots of machines, analog, spinning dials in the meter. And in particular, the generation technologies had kind of started to plateau in terms of their performance by the 1960s. And there's a really great historian of technology at Virginia Tech, Richard Hirsch, who has this book, Power Loss, and it describes the run-up to the electricity restructuring in the 1990s. And all that technology background and all the political dynamics of how we got there, and the passing of PURPA in 1978 to allow non-utility generation, how that set up restructuring. So Power Loss is a great read for people who are interested in this topic. But we have this plateauing technologically of the generation productivity in the 1960s, and the growth of nuclear in the 60s and 70s, and with a lot of cost overruns, particularly in the New England Mid-Atlantic and into the upper Midwest states. And that was leading to rate increases. And so there was a general concern about high regulated electricity rates, and do regulatory incentives really line up with cost minimization? I don't think even the biggest proponents of utility regulation in the 1980s and 90s would say that regulation was a panacea. That clearly public utility regulation was designed to quote unquote stand in for competition in cases where you have high fixed costs that lead to large economies of scale and scope. And but it was pretty commonly acknowledged that there are information asymmetries, that regulators can't observe fully what the cost structure is of the regulated utility. And so that standing in for competition was always going to be imperfect. And another kind of reading suggestion or someone to look into is the work of Alfred Kahn, who was the economist at Cornell, who famously Jimmy Carter appointed to the Civil Aeronautics Board. And then, and Kahn was just going to try to make everything more efficient and, get everything more aligned with marginal cost pricing for air travel. And then he gets there and he realizes, oh, hey, the justification, the legitimate justification for regulation in this industry has pretty much disappeared. And so, he showed up to reform the CAB, but actually ended up closing the CAB and turning the lights out and locking the door. But Fred Kahn, as an economist, famously wrote the book called The Economics of Regulation, where he lays out a lot of these principles. and so by the 80s and 90s, everyone knows that regulation doesn't necessarily perfectly lead you to least cost provision of electric service. But then you have all these cost overruns from nuclear and the prospect, because of PURPA, of all these non-utility generators, the invention of the combined cycle gas turbine, which can very efficiently generate electricity at lower scale and still compete with the big coal plants. And so you have a lot of these forces combining to lead up to the development of wholesale power markets in the 90s, and ultimately the restructuring of regulated utilities to unbundle the generation.
I'm smiling as you are walking through the history lesson, because much of what you said feels like what's old is new again. Many of those same issues are back, if they've ever left, and here we are having the conversations around them again. And so that's kind of where, obviously, that's what we want to chat with you about. So EPSA, as you know, is a strong advocate for markets. We think that that's the right way for us to try to achieve many of these objectives, but we're also not immune to understanding where the world sits today. There are current challenges and questions that remain in front of virtually all of the markets. As we think about that, what are some of the top questions from your perspective that we need to focus on to make sure that competitive markets can still deliver on the promise of what they were intended to bring?
Yep.
I'm sure there's a long list, so maybe give me your top 3 or 5.
There is a long list. Well, and I think, it's contested. Not everyone agrees with what I'm about to say, but I do think we have pretty good evidence that wholesale power markets and the competitive markets have yielded a lot of benefits, have yielded considerable benefits in terms of improving the production efficiency, improving capacity utilization, improving the generation efficiency in power generation. There's really great work on this from Steve Sakala at Tufts, and he's done really, really thorough analysis on hourly plant level generation data. And he has been able to show pretty authoritatively, I think, that the restructuring in wholesale power markets did lead to improved production efficiency and improved plant operations. But that's a very, and this, one of the reasons that this is a contested point is that, you'll often see people compare fully loaded regulated retail rates, or in vertically integrated states with the costs of energy coming out of wholesale power markets and then getting passed through to customers and bundled in with the transmission and distribution rates that are obviously still regulated. And so they'll do this comparison of restructured state prices and average prices and vertically integrated regulated average prices. And they'll say, well, look, the prices in restructured states are higher. So clearly restructuring didn't work. And there are so many mistakes in that logic. The first being, if you roll back into the 1970s and talk about the nuclear cost overruns and some of the other inefficiencies that came with regulation, the states that restructured for a reason. And so the reason they restructured was because their rates were high. So that's a very fallacious comparison to just make on a head-to-head basis. And so the right comparison to make is, what would the regulated rates have been in those states if they hadn't restructured? And that's a harder comparison. Back in the early 2000s, Jess Totten, who was a staffer at the Public Utility Commission of Texas, did that comparison for Texas. right? Because, and of
Mhm.
course, Texas is very contested then and now.
Sure.
But because you see a lot of this claim in Texas is we restructured in Texas, rates are higher than they were before restructuring, therefore restructuring has failed. And Jess actually did the comparison and said, okay, let's go back to 1997 and roll regulation forward. And if we had kept the same rate structure under regulation that we had then,
Right.
what would rates have been? And his analysis suggested that regulated rates would have been really higher. And so restructuring and competitive wholesale power markets have reduced rates compared to that counterfactual. But it also means we use fewer resources to generate electricity.
Mhm.
And that's the static efficiency benefit you get from markets. But you also have the dynamic efficiency benefits, which is the innovation and the ability to enter into that market with new technologies, new products and services. And of course, that's not perfect either because, and Texas again is a great example of this because there it's so plentiful in terms of the wind potential. And there's been so much innovation and so much
Mhm.
production cost reduction in wind. And so you have this huge growth of wind power in Texas. And of course, that's not a clean comparison either because you've got production tax credits that
Right.
provide it with subsidies. So everything in this industry is very murky, right?
Yeah.
You never have a really clean comparison because of all of the different ways that government policy influences decisions.
There's at least one thoughtful commentator who has opined about the fact that there hasn't been analysis done sufficient to their satisfaction about the actual demonstration of savings coming to consumers as a result of markets. And I dispute that. And we talk about the benefit of, the annual savings that are typically generated across an RTO. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts from the consumer angle. I don't mean to throw a curveball, but it's one of those that you talked about. I mean, these are, in the end, it's consumers that were driving restructuring, whether it was industrials or commercial, what have you. Those are the folks that wanted to see the benefit. Can we show that they've actually gotten that benefit?
I think it is complicated, and it's the easiest thing to show in terms of academic research has been the improvements in production efficiency and improvements in operation at power plants.
Mm-hmm.
And that's easy because, well, it's not easy, but it's more straightforward because you can, if you have data on the power plants before restructuring and then data on the power plants after restructuring, and then you can just do the natural experiment.
Yep.
The question, and so to the extent that improvement in efficiency is a general improvement that benefits consumers of all types, I would say that's the most straightforward. It's harder when you start, because electricity is a bundled service, right? It's a vertically, even if from an organizational perspective, it's not fully vertically integrated because generation has been unbundled and now you have independent power producers. The vision, and this is where the type of economics that I do, the institutional and organizational transaction cost economics, becomes really important because it reveals to you the idea that things that you thought you had to achieve through vertical integration, right, through having one firm do all the steps in the process, that if transaction costs fall enough, you can actually achieve more and have growth in markets, have more total surplus, more welfare through contracts rather than through vertical integration. And so this is the old work of the great, wonderful Ronald Coase. And so Coase's argument was always, why do firms exist? Firms exist because there's transaction costs, and it's cheaper to organize production within a firm if there are transaction costs.
Yeah.
But if transaction costs fall, then maybe it's cheaper for you to do stuff through contract. And that's part of the story of wholesale power markets and restructuring is transaction costs fell.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that is changes in the generation technology. Part of that is changes in the ability to set up a computerized power market. So
Right.
part of it's the digital story, and the digital story is what I'm really interested in. But it's hard to basically just have a punchline of what's the benefit for consumers, because you have all these moving parts. And the other moving part is, of course, the transmission and distribution wires.
Sure.
The fact that, sure, these assets have 40-year useful lives, but they still require a lot of maintenance and a lot of upgrades. And so there's a lot of capital investment that goes into the wires network. And so one thing you can look at is in restructured states versus vertically integrated states is what's the share of the energy portion of the customer bill.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been falling.
Yeah.
And I think that's a pretty good indication that wholesale power markets have delivered a lot of efficiencies. But we've had a lot of investment in the wires network that's passed through to customers.
Mm-hmm.
And we can talk about some of the perverse incentives in that. And certainly transmission is another big topic that I would put it probably in my top 3 questions. You said, what are your top 3? I guess my top 1 is thinking in terms of market design, some of the kind of Texas questions. How do we deal with market design and reliability? And number 2, I would say the integration of distributed resources, and then transmission is my number 3. So those are my top 3 questions right now.
And those are meaty issues. I mean, none of those is easy or simple. So the good news is, I mean, we have a lot of thinking to do. So one of the things we bump into at times is the misunderstanding about markets generally. And there was a recent piece in the New York Times where the author wrote a rather lengthy piece questioning the value of deregulation to deliver cost-effective power and other benefits. And you wrote a pretty detailed response, which of course we were happy to see that someone kind of took issue with and tried to walk through some of the, I won't call them mistakes, some of the points that were made that perhaps needed a response. Can you share kind of generally where you think that piece got things wrong, or what, maybe to say it another way, what the public ought to understand about restructuring and competitive power?
Yeah. And to his credit, I have to say the author, after I wrote that piece, he followed me on Twitter. So,
So mission accomplished.
Well, so yeah, he's not, I respect people who don't just tune out people who disagree with them. So that's something I really appreciate. And this was back in January, early February, I think. Yeah. And he was basically writing an article about what has happened to, the argument that that electricity prices have just been going up and up and up. Mm-hmm. And that in particular, the argument that there's a lot of exercise of market power, that there's that wholesale, that independent power producers basically are concentrated in ways that give them market power in the various markets. Mm-hmm. And I think it's correct to say that we have to pay attention to market power. But I think that there are a few things that I think he missed in that one thing is, and his article is based on a working paper by 2 economists, Mercadal and McKay, and which I also wrote about in the following week. But so I think in the New York Times article, one thing that I think it's challenging, and especially it's challenging for journalists, but it's challenging for anyone who doesn't eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff, is just how complicated this industry is.
That's right.
And in particular, and I would actually put the critique more on the Mercadal and McKay, the way they framed the paper, and Ivan Penn, the journalist, he basically just picked up on their theme and wrote an article based on the research that they did. And there are a lot of things that that persist and have persisted for 25 years. One is this, referring to what happened in the late 1990s as deregulation.
Yes, the word I detest.
Yeah, it's I have this laundry list of words that I'm like, I don't think that you keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think.
Yes,
it
the
means.
Princess Bride immediately comes to mind.
Exactly. Capitalism is one of those words.
Right.
I don't even use it anymore because it's just so freighted with so many different competing meanings. And similarly with deregulation and electricity, it is a liberalization to a certain extent because you're allowing for competition in wholesale power, but it's still very, very structured within a set of regulatory requirements. And so that's why I really bristle when I see the word deregulation, and it's an indication. I take it as an indication that whoever is using that word either has a particular worldview that they would like to communicate, or that they are not very deeply familiar with the actual history of the past 30 years and how we got here. And so, this use of the word deregulation is always a bit of a challenge. But then, there's a lot of concern about market power. But then in his particular case, he used California as an example. And I think, California in this industry, California is the example of, going out there being the first adopter, right, of regulatory changes.
Yes.
Right. And so the kind of, let's go out there and try this and see what happens. And so I think, California is not representative of the other states. And so if you see some behavior in California, you can't generalize from that to expect to see that in other, in Illinois, say, or Texas. And one thing that is, I think, a pretty important critique of both the New York Times article and the Mercadal and McKay paper underneath it is that they don't really account for the changes in the share of the retail rate. How the energy share has changed versus the wires share. And Mercadal and McKay have some data that suggests that share has been constant over time. And the EIA and other sources have data that suggest it isn't.
Right.
And then plus, if you talk to anyone who works with RTOs or works in this industry, and ask them, so what's been happening to the wires cost as a share of total cost versus the energy cost, and so their more kind of on the ground experience has been that share has not been constant over time. So right. I think there's just a lot of depth that you have to go into in thinking about these questions. But it's good. I'm glad I'm glad to have journalists at places like the New York Times who are writing about electricity pricing, because it's, it's something that seems to fly under the radar for a lot of people. But it's also the case, I think, that the typical, now I'm thinking about residential customers, but for certainly commercial and industrial customers, this is even more true, that for residential customers, a lot of them mostly do care about, what's my bill? I just want to do what I can to make sure my bill is affordable and not going crazy. But there are other things other than just price that can do that. There's, digital energy management technologies, and that's something that I would love to see more journalists focus on.
And I agree with you. It's nice to see some of the larger papers writing about some of this, because I think the systemic challenges that we are about to encounter, as the phrase I don't like to use, but many do, is the energy transition, which I think is more of an energy expansion. Because if we're going to get to the future state with more electrification and all the things that come with that, we're going to need more, not less. So it's a both and, not an either or discussion. So our goal, like yours, I think, is to try to help them get it right and write the most accurate piece possible. So I'm going to ask you a really significant question, then we'll do a lightning round of quicker questions that you can give me your immediate feedback to. So the big question really comes down to, a couple of things, but you talked about the 3 pillars, which are really the 5 pillars of our energy future. Can competitive markets deliver on those? Or should we accept the argument that some raise that, the vertically integrated models, really, it's simpler, which I don't agree with, but there are those who would say that it's simpler and it can deliver it. So let's jettison this 25-year experiment that just has not been effective. And we'll go back to the way God intended when we originally created, monopoly utilities. So that may be a leading question, but I'm happy to ask it.
It is a leading question. I'm happy to answer it.
Good.
I have to own my bias that I am probably a bit of a technological determinist, that I think the evolution of technologies really, really shape our lives and shape what's possible. And in particular, from an economics perspective, but in particular in this industry, I think it's the evolution of technologies change transaction costs and change what's possible to do through markets versus what you have to do through vertical integration.
Right.
And so, and I think it's been economically the case for certainly for the past 15 years with digitization, that retail, that retail is contestable, retail is potentially competitive, retail does not have natural monopoly characteristics, in the same way that in the 90s, we said, and I've been reading for a project I'm working on, I've been reading a 1997 New Jersey Board of Public Utilities report on restructuring.
Wow.
And it's great. It's such a great blast from the past. But I mean, it literally they say, it is very clear to us that the generation of electricity is no longer a natural monopoly. And they just say it flat out, right? Like that. And so, the area, so technological change changes what's feasible to do through markets. And we're not yet at the place where we can compete, where we can compete with the wires. The network effects, the economies of scale and scope are still pretty sizable just within the wires. But I would not artificially push back to vertical integration, because I think those forces of technological change push in a decentralized direction and push in a transaction cost reducing direction. What gives me some pause, and here's where I think I have some common cause with some of the folks who would argue for going back to vertical integration, is the political economy of regulation. and that, maybe we have some idealized picture of how competitive markets operate. And the reality, especially in this industry, is that we're not going to get close to that.
Mm-hmm.
That's just the political reality because of the various other kind of cultural and political dimensions, the constellations of political power that different stakeholders in the system have.
And have existed for a century and are
Yes.
hard to combat. Yes.
And
I'm very
are hard.
familiar with some of those.
Yes. So, so I do think that having, and this is where I would actually put in some James Madison and think about factions, right? Federalist 10. Then, and the idea is yes, we should have competitive markets, and the technologies are kind of moving in that direction. But we have to be very deliberate in our institutional design so that we can have rules that are more resilient to the exercise of political power, or to the potential existence of political power.
And we're always for minimal market distortions, although we live in a world where there are too many as it is. I don't think we want to layer more on top. So, all right, I know we are near the end of our time with you, so I have a handful of lightning round questions for you to just give us a quick response, and then we'll bring this to a close. So I'll start right with the first one, which is, should EV charging be competitive?
Yes.
Should competitive, or I guess I gave that one away. Let me try that again. Should transmission build out be competitive?
Oh, my deep theoretical brain says yes. My political economy brain says we're going to have to move in that direction incrementally, but I think we should go there.
Is net zero possible? Pick your time horizon, 10, 20, or 30 years.
Net zero. I think net zero is probably possible in 30 years. I was wrong about solar though. Back in 2003, I presented a paper at a conference where I said, the more we have distributed generation, the more the wires are going to become contestable or potentially competitive. So, DG competes with the wires. And it happened a decade faster than I thought it would. So.
All right, last one. Is carbon pricing dead?
My economist heart and brain would like the answer to that to be no. I do worry that a lot of the state level environmental policy, environmental regulatory changes have taken that air out of the room, so to speak. So, I'm definitely of that economist camp where, we have ill-defined property rights in climate, and so, clearly there is some external costs that we have to manage, and that the least invasive, least distortionary way to do it would be some form of pricing with some form of revenue neutral pricing. And I do think that things like renewable portfolio standards have, where they justifiably jumped into the breach and said, well, if Congress isn't going to do it, then we're going to do it. But it really has moved us into a more resource costly and more balkanized and more transaction cost laden way of dealing with decarbonization.
I think on that last question alone, we have opened the door for a second visit with you on a future podcast. So we can certainly talk about that. Lynne, you've been very generous with your time this morning, and we certainly appreciate your willingness to chat with us. There are myriad issues that we missed that we can come back to in the future, but we really appreciate your time, and thanks very much for your thoughts.
Well, thanks for the great conversation, Todd.
As you heard, this conversation only scratches the surface of an incredibly complex issue. Get more information and check out Lynne's full reading list on our podcast website at epsa.org. We also recommend subscribing to Lynne's Substack newsletter, Knowledge Problem. Thanks for listening to Energy Solutions. If you like this episode, please share it on social media or with your coworkers, friends, and family. You can also connect with us on Twitter at EPSA News and on LinkedIn. And subscribe, follow, leave a rating, or comment on Spotify, Pandora, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, which bring about 150,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.